Hey guys, welcome to the video. We're going to paint a tree frog today. So hopefully you guys, some of you will paint along with me. Otherwise, follow along, grab a drink, kick back, relax, and I will do my best to explain the painting and what's going on as we go along. So I try to include the drawing in some of them. In fact, guys, let me know below if you like the drawing included or want more of it or any of that kind of stuff. Or would you rather it just kind of jump to the painting? In fact, while you're commenting below, go ahead and like and subscribe ahead of time so you don't forget. All kidding aside, though, it does help the channel. It's a small channel, and doing my best to bring videos that would be interesting to you guys. So if you do like and enjoy this one, don't forget to like and subscribe. So again, I'm kind of drawing it out. I've looked at a few different pictures of frogs and tree frogs, and I liked this one. He was kind of hanging onto the branch. It's just kind of a typical tree frog look, like skinny little legs, and so I've kind of got him where he's grabbing a hold of the branch, and so drawing it all out in pencil, you've got to be really careful. I don't always draw it straight out on the watercolor paper like this. This is on a block, which means it's fastened on all of the sides, and in fact just like a little inch gap on the top where you can slide something in and unfasten the adhesive around it. And that's good because you don't have to tape it down. You can flip it open, ready to go, and it's not going to get loose and wavy and stuff as you paint and do multiple washes. The only other thing is that if you usually use like a light box or anything like that, you can't really do that with the block. However, you can, like I've shown in other videos, using the graphite paper, whether you're printing on the back of the graphite paper or you are just printing your drawing, your digital drawing, what have you, because the whole reason why you would not want to draw on the watercolor paper as much as you can is because it is quite sensitive. You can erase a little bit with the kneadable eraser, and even with the other one, as long as you're fairly careful. The problem is if you just use a regular eraser and go crazy on it, it will, I don't know if it takes off the sizing on the front or it just makes the surface different. So then you go in and you make multiple washes on it, then you're going to see a difference. And so it's not always the best thing. So if they're kind of simple drawings, and I don't know that I would call this simple. I guess just went for it on this one, but then I'll do it. But most of the time, I always regret the decision to draw straight on the watercolor paper because, there's always something that you're going to want to erase. I don't know about you guys, but I definitely don't draw perfect every time. I wish I could draw without erasing all the time, but that's just not the case. And so I always wonder if I'm erasing a little bit too much or if I'm hurting it. So far, so good. And I think it worked out good on this one, even though I erased a little bit with the kneaded eraser. It seems to work out pretty good. So, but I just want to preface that you don't always want to draw on this. I think the better way to go would be to draw on in your sketchbook, take a picture of it, print it out, or make a copy of it, or you can put tracing paper over it and then do the graphite onto it, whatever or however you want to do it so that you're not having to erase anything. And either way, you want to make sure the graphite is super, super light on there because if you use a really heavy, anything higher than 2B, and really usually I use H2H, which is the hardness of the lead and how smeary it will be kind of if it's in the B's. And because you don't want it to smear with the watercolors. It's not like graphite's waterproof or anything. So I'm diving in. As you can see, I've got a couple of different browns on the palette. And that's how I kind of like to do it, is to, before I start painting anything, is to mix a couple of, like the dark, the light, like kind of like 3 tones at least. I like to, because when you're watercoloring, you know, sometimes you'll do a layer and let it dry. But a lot of times I like to drop in, you know, wet on wet, the darker color a little bit. Sometimes it's just not enough, or it's not detailed enough. And so as that dries, then you'll need, you know, go in with the darker, which you'll see me do a little bit of all of it. So like right now, you know, I'm dropping in on that ledge a little bit of the darker in there. And right here, you'll see as I'm doing the middle, I'm going in with the lightest color, getting that all in there. And before it dries, as it goes in there, I'm going to drop a little bit of the darker, the next darker brown into it. Because when you do, when it's wet on wet, it doesn't have any edges. It blurs out nice and light. So that's good for certain steps, and you can there's only a certain amount of window that you can do that, because as it starts to dry, you don't want to play around with dropping it in there if it's starting to dry. So then you got to let the whole thing dry, and then you can do the next step. Going in with another layer with the next darkest part and kind of lightening it with a wet brush. And so right here, I had just dropped the darker in, and with a clean, damp brush, I was kind of taking up some of the brown where I didn't want it, like on that upper lip where it's more of a highlight. So even though it's wet and it's in there, you can still take a damp brush and kind of pull some of the color up. And so I'm doing the same thing down below, and now doing the same thing, starting with green on the top of the frog. So sometimes I will go in there with a wet brush. Sometimes I'll have 2 brushes, one with the color on it, and then one with just wet. And it's funny, like you would think like a dry brush would suck up more water and watercolor, but it's not the case. I've tried it. It's always better and always kind of pulls up more color if you rinse the brush and then dry it out. So it's like a damp brush. The damp brush always like pulls up more color than a super dry brush. And so just a little tip for me and you know, you always want to, like every time though, I want to try to keep pulling up the water and just drying it off. But it always pulls up more when I put it in the water and then kind of dry it off. So like damp, not as it gets dry. And so here I'm going in on another layer in the body of the frog with that same medium brown, and then I am kind of taking that wet brush and like spreading it out so that there's not a harsh line. I want the harsh line on the edge of the body of the frog, but not in the middle of the body of the frog. So kind of just letting it spread, and then taking that second brush and going in there and spreading it where I need to, is letting it work. And so those are the main steps that I do. I think no matter where I'm working on the frog, it's kind of like starting in with the lightest color, then you go in with the shades kind of where it's a little bit of wet on wet, and then once that dries, then you go in and really pronounce those darker places that you want. And where you don't want a stark line, then you can kind of brush it out while it's drying. Like take a damp brush and kind of, go over where the line is on the thing. Like I'm doing right there with the green, going over it so that you don't have a harsh line in the middle. Watercolor is tricky. It's like sometimes you would think just like the damp brush, I would think a dry brush would pull up more. Yeah, but a damp brush does. It's like some things are counterintuitive as you're learning with watercolor, and then some things are the way that you would think they would be. So it's all about, trial and error. And I think that the rule of thumb is kind of, at least for me, I've learned as I go along to kind of do it don't go full in. Don't go in with the loudest color. Don't go in with the darkest. You want to start in gradual and make gradual changes with the watercolor. And because every paper is going to handle different, every brush is going to handle different. And so the more you learn going forward with each incremental increase in the color and the shadows and stuff like that, you learn. Because even if it's been a little while since I've watercolored, like sometimes I still will make mistakes. I think my biggest thing that I've got to constantly remember is when you're dropping in color wet on wet and stuff, that when it gets to that point and stuff is starting to dry, you have to stop messing with it, even if it doesn't look exactly the way you want it to look. And a lot of times that's not even going to be the way it looks because it's still wet, but you've got to stop. You got to force yourself to stop touching it, because that's when you're going to make the mistakes. And you let it dry and you're like, oh, well, it may not be the shade exactly that you thought, and it may look good and not need to be touched again. Sometimes it's, you thought it was the shade and it really needs another layer or what have you, because it's not dark enough. A lot of the time, well, most of the time it dries in darker. I don't know what happened there. Like, I lost the footage on the first layer of the red with the eyes and the fingers and stuff. But here, again, going in just like before, dropping in where I want it to be darker red on the outsides, where it's pressing down and stuff like that on the fingers and around the eyes and a little bit. So I do it a little bit while it's still wet, but then once it dries, go back in and you can really define it. Because when you're doing it when it's wet on wet, it's not going to be the most defined because it's going to spread out. But again, when it gets to that point and you can feel it drying, or even that it's been, the more time you paint and stuff, you'll realize it's been that amount of time, I got to stop messing with it, because it will start, that's when you start to get backwashes and blooms and stuff, which can, by the way, look really cool. And I like to use them and drop water into it when it's starting to dry and stuff like that. But you want to do it when you want it there. I'll have to do a video on doing those purposely and what it can do and what it can look like, because it can make some really cool textures. But if you don't understand why or how it's doing it, it can be really super annoying. But again, I think the trouble happens all in those layers of the dry time. So if you don't master the dry time, or when you should stop messing with it and stuff, that's when you're going to have those issues. So, you're pushing the time and you go to just make sure that line is perfectly straight. And then when it dries, you see that right where you wanted to make it perfect is where it's lighter than the other spots, because as it was at a drying point, you've pulled up that color. So, again, it all comes with practice. But again, the more you go incremental and the more you don't, the more you stop when it is not thoroughly wet, the better. So down here, we're doing the feet, doing along the same lines, kind of going in. And sometimes once you've got a hang of the color that you're going in, you know how dark it's going to be, you can go in with it semi-dark, and then you'll see I'm going to switch and rinse out the brush and then just kind of fade it into going into the cream color and then into the green. But certainly when I was first starting out on the frog, I wouldn't have started even with that red color at the bottom of his foot. But again, you're putting the color in there and then taking it back out of the brush and fading it out. And that's all with water. A little bit goes a long way. Do you guys like I've got this sped up a little bit because I'm pretty much a slow painter and a slow drawer for that matter. So I don't think it's going like super, super fast. Would you guys rather see sped up versions like speed paints, or would you rather see spliced versions of real time or close to real time, for anybody that's following along or anything like that? Because it's hard to decide which way you should do it. You know what I mean? Show everything, because there's so much, you want to show, but be hours and hours long. Or is it important to show the key parts, spliced together? So if you have a preference either way, don't be afraid to let me know. So now, I've got everything in there. So you're constantly kind of looking at your, your reference pictures and kind of deciding where's not dark enough, where needs to be a little bit more shadow or highlight or anything. And you're kind of just going in and doing those extra steps, working around it slowly, kind of fading the colors out where you want them darker, or where you want them lighter, you can put dark around it, And it's hard to tell until you let it dry too. So you kind of gotta, watercolor always takes way longer than you would think, only because of all the layers that have to dry on the in-between. You got to remember, to put the shadows in there, like it's going to be darker under certain things and stuff. It's always good to have a reference. Like in this case, I used a few different references and stuff, but, it's always, at least for me, it always turns out way better when I have a reference, because it's going to be more realistic with the shadows and the highlights and stuff like that. And so now, that I've gotten the frog in, you can see like that stick is like nowhere near the dark, the color that it should be. And that's kind of how it works with watercolor as well. You start in incremental, because until you get everything in there, it's hard to tell if it's if it's darker or lighter or what have you. So if you kind of work everything up, then because you can always go darker, but you can't really go too much lighter once something is dried. So, you get it all in there and get as close as you can, and then keep going incrementally, because a lot of times you can't tell that something's off until it's dry, like the stick it was on, and now that you've got the darker shadows and stuff in there, then it kind of becomes obvious that, and then I'm also trying to put in some texture on the stick, getting the dark at the bottom, and so that it's going up, and it's just kind of like dropping in the color little bits here and there, is kind of letting it run, just kind of looking like a bark would look. And if that wouldn't have worked, doing those little, the texture or not enough texture, and then I probably would have let that dry and then gone in with some more brown and did some more texture. A lot of times, like the dry brush look on that kind of stuff will, excuse me if you can hear my nephew in the background. They were out on a walk, so I decided to do the voiceover, but apparently they're back. So again, like the eyes, were too light. So, you go in and do some darker parts with the seams and stuff like that. Now that might not even be dark enough once you get the black in there. Doing the black is so nerve-wracking, because like I said, once you go so dark, you can't go back. So that's where I get nervous about making mistakes and stuff like that, is with the really, really dark colors. But thank you guys for joining me.